Good evening, everyone. My name's John Parker, Technical Director at the Arboricultural Association here in Stonehouse in the UK. And I'd like to welcome you to the first part of our new online lecture series, An Ecosystem Approach to Urban Forestry. This is a three-part series, which will be broadcast live this evening, next Wednesday, and then the Wednesday after. So if you haven't signed up for the next two webinars, please do so. If you've already watched some of our webinars over the last few weeks, then you may well have received an email this week inviting you to contact us if you'd like a certificate of attendance to use towards your continuous professional development. So if you're interested in that, please let us know. And all of our webinars are also available through the website, so you can catch up on any that you've missed. Although at the moment, certificates of attendance can only be made available to people who attended the webinar when it was first broadcast. So we're working on question and answers and things for the stuff that's on YouTube, but go and catch up anything you missed. This evening, you'll be hearing a joint presentation from Rob Northrop and Michael Andreu of the University of Florida. And they'll be presenting for about 40 minutes or so. And then we'll be going into a discussion session led largely by the comments you make in the chat and the questions you submit using the Q&A button. We're really keen, as ever, to see what kind of dialogue emerges, what everybody thinks. So please do participate in the chat. And as I've said a couple of times now, make sure you select the option to send your comment to all panelists and attendees. Otherwise, not everybody will get to see your contribution. Try and avoid anonymous contributions unless there's a particularly good reason for you to do so as well, because it just makes everybody feel paranoid. I'm sure we'll be having lots of questions and lots of comments. We won't be able to make it through all of them, so please don't be offended if I don't ask your question, okay? I know sometimes people get very irate. It's nothing personal, I promise you. If it is anything personal, you'll know who you are. So, right, so now I'm going to hand you over to your speakers, Rob and Michael. Gentlemen, it's over to you, and I'm going to try and make myself disappear by popular demand.
So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I see there are people from all over the world here today. Michael Andreu is my good friend and my principal colleague. I'm Rob Northrop. We're delighted to be here. We first want to thank the Arboricultural Association of the UK for all of these webinars that they've been hosting on urban forest conservation and management. They've been absolutely brilliant. And they have brought the conversation and the exchange of ideas and the sharing of perspectives and ideas from different parts of the world. And I think that's a great thing. We think it's a great thing. We think it's one of the things about urban forestry that needs to happen, is that urban forestry is this emerging discipline, and it's happening rather quickly. The development of the discipline, and we need to share all of what we've learned. And so Michael and I, that's what we're here for. We're here to have the conversation with you and to exchange some of the things that we've learned, and some of the things that have worked and some of the things that didn't work on our road to finding an ecosystem approach to urban forestry.
And we're hoping
Go ahead, Michael.
Too. I just want to say we're hoping we can learn some things as well along the way.
Yeah, and we're hoping we can learn some things, right? That's important. So I want to stop right here, though, Michael, and just say that we're going to say we did this a lot because it's true. We've been involved in a lot of what we're going to show you, but we want to make sure that it's understood that when we say we, there are many other people involved. Particularly, I want to mention Kathy Beck, who is the municipal arborist for the city of Tampa for more than 40 years. It was her courage and insight that allows a good bit of this to happen in real life, not just in an academic sense, but in practice. I want to also mention Ross Dickerson, who is the supervisor of over 32,000 hectares of habitat for rare, threatened, and endangered species in the Tampa Bay watershed, also for his courage and his insight and his energy. And principally, also, we want to mention Sean Landry, professor of geography and an absolute wizard of GIS over at the University of South Florida, He's been one of our principal collaborators for 14 years. So Sean's right with us all the time. Wayne Zippera, a landscape ecologist and forester from the U.S. Forest Service. And then the newbie on the block, but certainly not the least one on the block, is Dr. Andreu, who is a research scientist in arboriculture, also from the University of Florida, who plays a principal role in many of the things that we're going to talk about. So the goal of this series is to share what we learned about how to integrate social and biophysical science to develop strategic urban forest management plans and public policy to sustainably support multiple and diverse outcomes. And we'll lay out the framework for an ecosystem approach to urban forest management planning and implementation that we used, we again, all of us in Florida, USA. We believe the framework can be adapted to use in other cities, other states, and other countries. And that's what we're here to share with you today. Urban forestry has emerged during the latter part of the 20th century as a response to the unfolding of the Anthropocene. And this map of the lights at night taken from satellites demonstrates just how widespread urbanization and the growth of human population has occurred in our world today. And we can see just geographically how much of the space is now being occupied by what were rural areas at one point, but now that are decidedly urban and managed by urban societies, often in very critical and productive parts of our world in terms of productivity, in terms of food, fisheries, and timber also. So in our own country, where Michael and I work in the United States, this is what we see as projected over the next 30 to 40 years. We begin to see the emergence of these mega regions, not only bigger metropolitan regions that are growing out from the core of what we would consider cities, but actually these metropolitan regions beginning to merge together and create these mega regions. And you can see down at the bottom of your screen on the right-hand side, the peninsula of Florida. And as my friend Sean Landry likes to say, in reality, that whole peninsula of Florida is an urban forest today. And so I wanted to show you that and see the context a little bit in which we're working. And what we will talk about today is that urban forestry is really an ongoing conversation between the biophysical world and social values carried out in the language of ecological processes. It is a hard but rewarding dialogue and a necessary one for us to have today, we believe, and it is the focal point of the urban forest discipline as it begins to emerge. Michael, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, do you want to give a quick introduction of yourself, Rob, and sort of a little bit about your background?
Sure, I can do that. I've been working in with urban issues, okay, so I guess the thing to start out is I'm a forester and a wildlife biologist, an ecologist, and I come to this from the other side, kind of, rather than coming from inside the city. I came to urban forestry from the need to address forest conservation and forest management outside of the truly urban areas. So about 40 years ago, I began doing this. And what became very obvious to me was the emergence of the Anthropocene, the growing metropolitan regions, and how it was the social values and the economic drivers of the urban that were beginning to influence how the forest could or could not be conserved for all of its different values outside of the urban core. And so I realized that as a conservationist, what I needed to do was to get out of the forest and get into the public policy and get into land use planning and direct my attention to the drivers of the change of the forests that I was concerned about. Michael?
Yeah, Thanks. And my name is Michael Andreu, and I also sort of have a little bit of a similar background as Rob, but also a little bit different. And I grew up here in this area that's being shown on the screen here in Florida, and so this is my part of the world where I was raised and watched it change over time. And my background is really also as a forester, and I come at this from that perspective. I've worked with a variety of organizations, with NGOs, Nature Conservancy. I've worked with government agencies. I've worked with industry, and even private landowners. And so I really come at this problem and this through the lens of a forester, looking at it from the big picture, but also, you know, managing at the individual tree level. My education, again, is as a forester, forest management and silviculture, and really sort of came to urban forestry through a roundabout pathway of seeing change over time, seeing the area I grew up develop and change over time, and without a lot of thought going into it. And so I think it's important that we think about how we approach problems, and I try to approach problems both as a scientist, my formal training as a scientist, and as well as a land manager, and that's sort of where I begin this story.
Yeah, Michael, I think that's a good point. Is that we both were foresters and land managers, and we're managers.
Right.
So we're both scientists, but actually practitioners at the same time. And this is something that we want to emphasize over these three times that we get together with you, is that what we're trying to show you, we believe, has practical application. And we believe that academia working on its own separately on these ongoing ecological issues in our world today, and practitioners working separately in their own realm is not a good way to go. And that we need to integrate the scientists in with the practitioners to better identify the work that needs to be done and to better address the rigor of science to finding solutions to everyday problems.
So what we're going to be doing today and over the next few days is we're going to talk about those issues. Today, what we wanted to do was sort of start at the end of the story and then work backwards over the next following two sessions. Today, we want to give you a case study. Today, we want to tell you about the place that we've worked in and how it arrived to be functioning, that urban forest, how it arrived to be functioning in the way that it does. And so that's what we're going to be telling you today, is this case study. And then from that, hopefully we'll talk about the principles associated with that over the next couple of meetings, and how you can actually do this, how we approach problem solving, and how we actually tried to do this, the framework by which we developed these ideas. So the story begins, and this is, again, we're looking at Florida in the United States, and this map here shows Florida broken up into some subregions here. We're in particular looking at this part of Florida that's southwest or southwest central Florida, the Tampa Bay area. Okay, and so that's where the story begins, and the story begins right around 2005 when I first arrived in this area, having come back in, and Rob also was newly arriving in this area, taking on a new role as the extension forester for this area. What was happening in 2005? Well, if we think back in time, that was at a time when the economy was booming. And in Florida in particular, there was a tremendous amount of development going on. And we hadn't yet hit the housing bubble yet, right? So things were just rapidly changing. And this was creating a lot of concern in people. There was concern from individuals and entities that the forests were really rapidly changing and they were being lost to development. And there was this feeling that the services providing by these forests were being lost. And so that was a bit scary. and that trees were being taken out in the name of development. And so that was a lot of people that shared those concerns. On the other side of that equation, there were people that really felt that development was being hampered by the government. It was getting in the way, and that these tree ordinances that were existing were arbitrary and they were onerous and they were actually hindering development. And so you had this real, and these were all feelings that people experienced, and they're real feelings, right? These were they were leading to conflict, and they were leading to frustration, and they were leading to lack of trust in this process. And the question is why? What's going on there? Well, there was no information out there. So all these things that people were feeling were based on what they saw as they were driving down the highway, what they experienced along the way. And there was a lack of information. And along with that lack of information, there was a lack of any kind of way to communicate about what they were seeing or feeling or concerned about, without sort of just hand waving and saying it's going downhill, or there's too much government and it's problematic. And so there was this breakdown in communications, and this was leading to a lot of problems. And so these series of slides that Rob showed you is sort of indicative of what we were seeing and what we still see today to some degree of this, massive change in land use on the landscape in this area around the Tampa Bay watershed. And the Tampa Bay watershed is a very important part of this because it was the identifying feature of the culture of this part of the world.
And Michael, I want to just interject here that also what comes out of this lack of being able to communicate and being unable to identify the source of problems, the real problems, not just the symptoms, is we wind up with a sincere lack of trust. People do not trust each other. People are making arguments, and the people that they're making arguments with simply don't listen because they don't trust them. They have no common ground in which to have real arguments that are productive.
Right. And so in short, there's a lot of dysfunction in this area at the time. So let's now, that's sort of setting the stage of what happened in 2005. Let's sort of fast forward now to today, where we are, this same area that we just described, and where we are today in the Tampa Bay area. And I'm going to zoom in a little bit and talk to you about some of the things that are happening in the city of Tampa. We talked about that information need and the lack thereof. Today in the city of Tampa, they now have a full citywide inventory of their forest. And not only have they gotten a snapshot of what their forests look like, but they've done this repeatedly, multiple times. So on a 5-year cycle. And so they now have 3 snapshots of what their urban forest looks like today. And they're beginning actually in the process of ramping up and about to start their 4th inventory. What that means is that we are now starting to get to a sense of change over time, how these urban forests are changing as a result of development, as a result of policy, as a result of just biophysical growth, right? And so there's all of these things, but we're moving from just seeing pictures to now we're starting to get a movie in essence. And so that's very interesting. From a social standpoint, again, there was a lot of mistrust, misunderstanding of who was doing what and what was important to the people and what was important to the city. The city is now has done 7 formal social surveys of their citizens. They've done numerous focus groups, and they really have a lot more information about of what the people think and how they value these urban areas. The city has shifted the management of the urban forest from the Parks and Recreation Department to the Department of Planning. That's a big deal. What that means is that this area, this city, now has sort of raised the level of the status of urban forestry from something that was always the last at the end of the budget, and getting the whatever was left over, to being actually part of the planning process and part of the budget process, and is really, it's at the table for discussions.
And Michael, if I could just interject there for a second, that
Sure.
that occurs primarily not because of the biophysical inventories and analyses that goes on. That's important, of course, but that occurs because of the social surveys and the focus groups. Because what happens is during that process is that now the political body recognizes that we are cognizant of the fact that what is driving this really is the values of the people. And so once that happens, then the executive branch and the city council determine that, okay, this is no longer parks and recreation dealing with trees and shrubs as objects or simply as aesthetics. Not that aesthetics is not important, but, and it takes it out and it puts it right in the core of city management. And it not only does that, but it elevates the municipal arborist position to just one step below the principal land use planner in the entire city.
Yeah. Really putting things, again, as you said, it's because they had that social context, because they had that understanding of the people and the citizens of the area. Other cool things that are happening there. As a result of all of these things, the City of Tampa has a comprehensive management plan developed. And what's really important about how they developed their plan is that it had explicit and measurable objectives. Okay, well, this is important to have. Again, we talk a lot about management plans and how important they are, but they actually not only had these explicit and measurable criteria or objectives that they could look back on, but they had a means by which they could do it. These inventories, these social surveys allow them to go back and find out how they're doing relative to what they stated they wanted to do. And the city found this to be so valuable that, in fact, they incorporated this into their comprehensive plan. Okay, and Rob, would you like to speak a little bit about that?
Sure. In the U.S., when we use the phrase comprehensive plan, that is the foundational form of law for local and county governments. So it would be the equivalent of like the Constitution for a country or something like that. So when they took this plan and they incorporated the whole thing into their comprehensive plan, they gave it as strong a legal foundation as they possibly could. They made it fundamental to the way that the city operates. The other thing I'd like to mention about what you're seeing on your screen now is just a couple of the criteria that were developed by the city, but you can see the performance indicators, and those indicators, like let's say species suitability for climate zones and environment, they are themselves measurable by the biophysical inventories that are conducted every 5 years. So the city can actually see whether they are moving in a positive direction or in a negative direction on their most critical criteria for urban forest sustainability.
And again, as a result of it being in that comprehensive plan, it means that this cannot just be a plan that ends up on a bookshelf somewhere. It is actually referred to and regularly utilized. And that's a big deal. One of the other neat things, and maybe one of the last things I'll tell you about for now, is that because of all this information, and this now they have information, now they can communicate with one another about what they're seeing out there, what condition it is, where it's located, etc. They can begin to create a new approach to policy making. And one example of that they have is that the City of Tampa has created mitigation ordinances that are based on, rather than just some arbitrary, you take out a tree of X size and you got to replace it with 12 of these smaller ones, which seem very arbitrary to many people. They've begun to use an approach that's based on replacement of trees based on loss of leaf area and or loss of services associated with that tree. That's what they're replacing, not just some arbitrary diameter replacement. And so, you know, you've got a slide here that shows sort of how that works, and we're not going to go into details on that at this point in time, but it's a very, very interesting approach and novel approach to developing policy.
Yeah, Michael, this is a significant shift example of moving away from looking at the trees as objects to looking at them as part of ecological systems and relationships. Because now this city has begun to say, okay, when we mitigate the tree, we don't just want to replace the object, we want to replace the function of the tree. Okay, and we know that at least at this point, our best attempts to measure the ecological values of atmosphere, water, temperature regulation is primarily associated with the canopy, and as Michael mentioned, leaf area index is how we'd say it technically. So now what they say is replace the canopy within 5 years, replace the function of the urban forest, not just the object, the tree.
Yeah. So that's a little bit about Tampa and how it shifted from 2005 to where it is today. And a lot of, I hope you can see there's a lot of neat things and interesting changes have happened over that 15-year period. And along the way, and we're going to tell you this story more, but along the way, others saw what was happening, and so in the area, and they reached out and said they wanted to see what they could do. And so maybe Rob can tell a little bit about some of the other things that have happened.
Sure. Well, it's attracted some attention for Tampa, which of course all political bodies and all don't mind getting some real positive press. This happens to be one of them. MIT looked at urban tree canopy from the personal level, from the person walking down the street, and now recognizes Tampa as the #1 best place in the world in terms of seeing green if you're a person walking around the street. And I'm going to shift over to some other parts of this watershed that we're working in. I had to use this picture as a transition slide. One of my favorites, and it always reminds me of why we do this. This was a tree planting program we were having fun with in the summer at a local park, and we got to plant a couple of trees. And I turned around as we were putting the mulch around the tree, and where were all the kids? Well, the kids were under the shade, under this big tree, telling us the message that the trees really did matter to them. So what happens then when, after we begin this work with Tampa, and it gets a little bit of recognition and people are seeing that this process has some value, we wind up getting an inquiry from the United States Environmental Protection Agency. And they are creating a program for place-based ecosystem service research. In other words, what they want to do is they want to help create tools for people to be able to estimate and begin to manage for ecological services. And they came to Tampa. They picked Tampa because they had seen all the work that we were doing. We, again, the big we, all of us, not just Michael and I, or a couple of academics. And they were very interested also in merging their scientists with practitioners and creating practical, valuable, usable tools. So what we did with them was we took a look then at the entire watershed, and you can see the entire watershed outlined in the black and white lines, and all the yellow X's and the yellow dots, those are all permanent plots. So this is what we have now in the Tampa Bay watershed that we use as the boundary of our work from an ecological perspective. So we have 822 permanent plots that we look to measure over time, again, just like we did in the city. what we began to do with them was to look at nutrient cycling in wetlands and mangroves and nitric oxide reduction potential of roadside buffers using trees, and also to look at ecosystem services provided by forests in general across the entire watershed. Well, as this begins to happen and we begin to get this information out, and you can see this is a graphic of the information that was produced from that particular look and particular partnership between the researchers and the practitioners, we begin to see emerge in the entire watershed that it's the forests that have the highest value in terms of producing ecological goods and services, even beyond wetlands. This then begins to draw the attention of the Hillsborough County, which is the biggest county within the watershed, and it manages 32,000 hectares of rare, threatened, and endangered species habitat. And what they look to do then is to develop a plan for the management of these 32,000 hectares based upon the same principles and the same steps that were taken to develop this urban forest management plan. And of course, what they begin to realize too in Hillsborough County is that in this watershed where Hillsborough County exists, they have just about 3 million people. And that while they have 32,000 hectares of this habitat, this rare, threatened, and endangered species habitat, it is now being surrounded and being infilled by the city itself. And of course, this is what we're seeing all over the world, right? We're seeing that these spaces that we had conserved as important natural heritage areas are now becoming embedded in urban areas. And this is creating unique challenges and unique and novel landscapes, if you will, that did not exist before. So what happens with this particular group that manages these Hillsborough natural areas is that they call upon Michael and I to come and help them because the county commissioners are wondering why they own these lands. Why not just sell them and bring money in to support the budget? So what we do is we go back to our friends at EPA and our other friends that I mentioned earlier, and we begin to create an ecosystem goods and services analysis of all these lands. And they turn out to be worth vastly more than they could ever get money for. And as a matter of fact, they found out within a 2.5-year period, the ecosystem services for these lands were worth more than all the money that they had spent on buying the lands in the first place and managing the lands at the present time. So the county commissioners say, okay, we're not going to ask you to sell these lands. We create a strategic plan. They take this strategic plan and they use it as the basis for creating a new Department of Conservation and Environmental Lands Management. What happens out of this is that not only do they not lose land, they get a huge bump in the amount of money that's laid out to buy new land, and they get a big bump in their budget for the management of their land. It's a very significant occurrence in our part of the region. So today they've learned how to manage the lands from an ecological perspective, from longer time frames. They now look at managing parcels of land on 20 and 30-year management cycles instead of like short project-based cycles. And they have also learned from us and from EPA how to now monitor the ecosystem goods and services on their lands themselves, so that they have become more resilient in terms of how they can do this. Michael, that's about it from there. I guess we wanted to mention that in Florida, this was not a typical scenario. And in fact, we are in the process and have just finished up. Andrew Koza's with us today, and he's handled the vast majority of this, looking at measuring and doing an analysis of the entire state's urban forest canopy, so that we can begin to monitor what's going on across the whole state, and to help people in other parts of the state begin to incorporate this idea of measuring and monitoring and managing their metropolitan regions from an ecological perspective, to ensure that the forest can continue to deliver the services and the goods that society needs to sustain itself.
And it's by doing that that we then create the vernacular, the vocabulary, the ability to communicate about the values and importance of these forest systems.
Right. And we're
you
hoping,
know,
I think, Michael, we're hoping that this becomes then the way that communication can occur at the state level.
Right.
And we can have this conversation at the state level, because we need these larger government organizations to participate in this, to help to facilitate dialogue between metropolitan regions, because we're all connected, really.
That's right. That's right. So I think the next question really we want to do is we tried to lay out for you a sense of where Tampa Bay area was and where it is today, and how, you know, the sort of, but we didn't really fill in the gaps of how that happened. How did you move from that dysfunctional place to seemingly a place that is really sort of taking a proactive approach to managing their forests, both there within the city and in the surrounding areas. And so I think that's what we want to sort of talk about now, and give you a little bit of a timeline of our framework, our approach to how we did this, or how we took this problem on. Again, when we started out in 2005, both Rob and I were really new in this area. Although I had grown up in Florida, I had not lived in this part of the state, and I had been out of the state for a while. Rob had come from a different region of the United States. And so we started out as scientists, right? Asking questions. We began to try to get information about what were the forests, where were they, what did they look like, and what we realized is that there's not a lot out there, and so we began to think, hey, this is a big problem. There's a lot of change going on. There's a lot of friction between the various players. We need to start really gathering information about this problem. And what we did, our first step was, we realized this problem was much bigger than anything that Rob or I could take on individually, even as a team. We needed to really reach out to a broader set of people. So we started trying to identify who all was doing things, who was involved in the management of the urban and urbanizing forest in this area. And in many cases, these entities didn't necessarily identify themselves as that was their primary function, right? In many cases, although they had jurisdiction over these areas, they didn't see themselves as necessarily as urban forest managers or managers of urbanizing forests. So we started to reach out and have conversations with all these different partners, and bringing them to the table, and started to ask these questions about, you know, how is the forest distributed? What condition is it in? How is it changing? What extent is it changing, and who's responsible for managing that change? And even some obvious questions like, you know, what are the drivers to the change? That seems obvious. It seemed like it was development, but we really didn't know. And, you know, what are the impacts to those changes? Again, without baseline information, you can't begin to even assess what are the impacts that are out there. And then the biggest question that we were asking was, what do people want? How do people in this area care about the forest, and what do they want from their forests? And so that was our first step, was really bringing people together. You want to talk a little bit about that, Rob?
Yeah, I mean, because again, Michael was from Florida, so he had some experience here. Please recognize that we work and live in a semi-tropical part of North America. Probably the only really semi-tropical part of North America. So in the United States, there's not a great deal of support for these types of forest ecosystems, okay? It's not like other big parts of the United States where there's a tremendous amount of work that's been done. So we were asking, when we first got here, we would go around to different government agencies and we would say, well, where is the forest? And they would hand us some really generalized maps that were years old and say, well, we think it's here. But they didn't know where it was. They literally didn't know where the forest was. When we asked them what condition was it in, for the most part, they didn't know or didn't recognize the question, you know. So there was very little that was known about the forest. And because there was very little known about the forest, there was very little management at all going on. And when I use the word management, I don't mean just managing the forest as a forester, but policy and land use development that recognized the forest at all as functioning. It was just a thing that was there and they kind of knew where it was. Okay, and they weren't making the connection. I'll give you an example. Is a big concern in the region had been the restoration of the Tampa Bay, a very productive estuary that our area surrounds, the Tampa Bay watershed. There was a great emphasis on restoring the Tampa Bay. In that big program, big federal program, there was no consideration for the conservation and the management of the forests that were acting as the filters and of pollutants and the regulators of flows that were all going into the Tampa Bay that had such a great impact on the quality of the bay and the functioning of the bay itself. That's the most obvious disconnect. So there were lots of disconnects. What Michael and I did was we contacted everybody that we could think of, every agency we could think of within the Bay area, Tampa Bay area, and had them come and to get them to tell us where it was, what condition it was, and to help us understand what the problems were that they were facing. Because that was of first major importance. So we got all kinds of government agencies, state, local, county government agencies, and nonprofit, and just private citizens, and sometimes just professionals that showed up. We carried on 7 facilitated meetings with these folks to develop what they thought was an agenda for the conservation of the forests in the Tampa Bay watershed. So this was fundamentally important. This is not Michael and me saying this was the thing to do. We were already asking, what is it that's going on here? And what do you think needs to be done? So Michael, you gonna say something?
I was just going to say, I think for many people at the table, as they came together, they began to have their eyes open to different scales and scopes of what the problem was and how this issue comes together. Many of them saw themselves in their silos of their agency or their jurisdictions and didn't recognize that the integration across of either they were replicating efforts or there were big gaps between what different agencies were doing. And so it was one of the first times as we brought people to the table that they began to have these broader conversations and saw the interconnectedness between things like the forests and the water quality in the bay. And people were, starting to have that conversation. I think that was really important as well.
Yeah, and so what we're showing you right now is this is what comes out of those 7 facilitated meetings that we conducted. Okay, so this is not what Michael and I had to say. This is what these 60 some odd individuals from these different government agencies, nonprofits, and all come about. This is what they say the mission needs to be. Okay, I guess what I'm showing you right now really is this is what Michael and I were told to do. this was the mission, to use a scientific framework for ecological assessment and sustainability for the watersheds, trees, and forests.
Rob, I should say we can only see that really, really small. We couldn't see the full screen slide there, so that bit you were just describing.
No, huh? Let me try and fix that.
I thought that was just me, but yeah. I think you're showing the wrong screen, Rob.
Is that right?
Perfect.
There you go.
Can you see it?
No, you had it before.
Now?
That's now.
Okay, sorry, that's strange. Okay, never mind. We're not claiming to know anything about Zoom here. So this was the mission, right? Create a scientific framework, ecological assessment, and sustainable management of watersheds, trees, and forests. And that's what we're here to discuss with you. Is what we that framework, and we're going to show that to you. And with great detail over these 3 times we're going to be together. The other thing is, these were the goals that they set out: to understand the watersheds ecosystem, understand how the forests are changing, place-based ecosystem, ecological knowledge to support education and activities, and to contribute to decision-making at a wide scale of geographic ranges.
And that's something, that list right there has become what we try to follow and have been following for the trying to support over those last 15 plus years, and we're continuing to do. It's an ongoing effort.
And that's exactly right, Michael. It's an ongoing effort, and that effort it's that conversation between societal values and the use of science and technology to play out management across the landscape. And it's a conversation. It's an unending. Conservation is an unending dialogue. Right. So that's when we recognize that. And so when we took this on, we took it on seriously and said, we are going to do this. And for 15 years, I can say that I have never deviated from that mission and those 4 goals. Always what we've done has been within that.
So again, sort of thinking about the scientific process, we've collected, you know, the what is known, what is unknown, where the gaps in knowledge are, and through this process, we identified some of the questions, and through the Tampa Bay watershed, sort of where do we want to be down the line. And so our first steps, and you know, we're foresters, so our first steps were to think we need to get, you know, let's fill some of these gaps, let's answer some of these questions, and so we began to do an inventory of the area. And the first entities, you know, that inventories don't happen for free. And the first entity that really stepped up to the plate to see the value of this conversation and the importance of it was the City of Tampa. And so they kicked in some funding, and our team collectively came together and designed and developed you know, a system by which we could inventory and get a sense of where the forest was, what condition it was, what it was composed of, and you know, try to answer some of those things, and also answer what are some of the values that it's producing, that biophysical stuff. Our approach, while the City of Tampa was the ones that brought us the first round of funding, our approach was that's not the way we want to approach this problem. This is not just simply a what's going on in this city type of question. This is about this broader ecological context. And so we said, let's not just measure within the city boundaries, that municipality, let's actually try to measure outside. And back on slide 11, I think it was, Rob, you can sort of show them if you can share that screen.
Hope so. Yeah, I got it. Go ahead.
You're on the small screen side.
Mine scroll screen again?
Yeah, your small screen right now.
I do it.
So this sort of, yeah, this map here shows the area of the Tampa Bay that we sort of became our first study area. The area in the left-hand map you can see is the area in black, the boundary in black, and that's mostly yellow. that is the city of Tampa proper. And those were where we decided to lay out our plots. So we randomly located those plots across the city to try to capture the range of conditions in that city. The area in red, that's outlined in red in either of these maps, that represents all the sub-basin watersheds immediately adjacent to that city. We really wanted to talk about the entire Tampa Bay watershed, the area by which every drop of water in theory that fell in that area ended up making its way to the Tampa Bay. But that was just too much for us to tackle. So what we did was we identified those sub-basin watersheds, and that area in red is where we located additional plots. And you can see we had about 200 plots within the city and almost 300 plots in the surrounding sub-basin watershed. We were hoping that this would then give us a really good snapshot of the condition of the forest, where it was, what it was, condition it was in, and what services it was providing. And it did. It worked out that way. Now, that's the way we started this process, by looking at the forest. We're foresters. We approach this problem as this is a forestry problem. But if you hear us talking, we talk a lot about conflict. And that conflict's not between trees. That conflict is between people. And so while we started the process by measuring the forest, sort of hindsight 2020, and we're jumping a little bit ahead here, but hindsight 2020 says maybe that's not the place we should have started. You want to add to that, Rob?
Yeah, I mean, we both recognize that now, that really the place to start when you begin to try to create a strategy or an urban forest management plan is with the people. And so the next iteration of our work, we went to another city in Florida, and the very first thing we did, even though the city didn't even think it was necessary, we developed, along with one of our social science partners, a survey so that we could try to get about 1,000 people in the city to give us their opinion about their values and their attitudes before we even started. Because keep in mind that it's based upon those values about what the political body thinks is important, that's going to direct the government on what to do. In these urban areas, public policy is so prominent because there's so many people that the land that's open and available is a greater preponderance of it is public. So getting the public values is critical to creating sustainable urban forest systems. So today, we would say the first thing you really want to do is to get out there and get the public values up front. Of course, Michael and I did that to a certain degree when we held all those facilitated sessions. Later on, we had a big symposium with the mayor's office in Tampa, where we facilitated about 120 or 30 people telling us more about what they wanted. We recognized it, but sometimes in that case, circumstance dictated that we had to go and do the biophysical first. But I would suggest to you that anybody who's looking to begin to do this, that put some of your money in a social survey first, understand what the people value, and then go from there. You'll have much more support from the political body in the end, including the budget that they control.
But yeah, and so that's our wisdom from today. But at the time, that's not how we did it, and so we had this information about the forest. But even then, that was helpful to have this body of information about the forest and where it was, what it looked like, what species were there, and some of the services that it was providing. And so we took that information from there back to the city of Tampa, and we shared it for them. And again, this is one of the first times they sort of had this quantified data about the forest. Instead of descriptive, qualitative data about how important it was or how pretty it was, or how much it was impairing their ability to build new buildings, they had data that everybody could agree was factual, it was based on scientific principles, and it, again, provided them with a vernacular by which they could communicate and talk about the forests. And that was a big moment for those city principals, the leadership within the city, for the first time to really be able to think about the forest in this way.
And I think just to conclude this part, Michael, I'd like to say that in all instances in which we've worked to develop strategic plans, in all of them, the Tampa, the other city in Florida, and with the big natural areas folks in Hillsborough, in their strategic plans now are written that every 5 years they will monitor those ecosystem services and goods, right? But in conjunction, every 5 years when they do the physical, biophysical surveys, they are going to conduct social surveys at the same time so that they can monitor the change of the values of the people who exist within the city. Because ecological systems do not exclude humans. Humans are part of those systems, and they are changing just along with the changes in the biophysical aspects of ecosystems too. And so all of it has to be monitored. And it's really a good idea for anybody doing management to monitor all those things at the same time. And then you can begin to correlate changes in the biophysical by changes in the values of the people. You can see how the values are playing out on the landscape, but you can also perhaps see over a long period of time how the changes in the landscape are playing out on the values that we're seeing in the people who live there. This is relationships. This is an ecosystem approach to urban forest management and conservation. Michael, if it's okay with you, you want to turn it back over to John and answer some questions?
Sure.
Yeah?
Yeah.
That was brilliant, obviously. Thank you very much, guys. Okay. There's a lot to think about there, as ever. There's lots of chat been going on. You've probably been too busy to look at it, but there's some really good conversation been happening, some really great questions coming in. I just wanted to focus, I guess, before we move into the questions properly, just on a little piece of the chat that I really liked, and sorry to pick on people, but comment from Rahul saying that these issues are coming up in developing countries like India. And then Isabella said, yeah, we've got the same thing here in Brazil. And then Guyane is saying it's very challenging in the same way in developing countries like Nepal. And Astrid has said, yeah, we've got the same thing in Germany. And I just think it, apart from showing that the breadth of people who are watching this all over the place, it's just that everyone's got the same problems. We keep saying this in all the webinars. Everyone's got exactly the same issues. It's just how we tackle those issues that perhaps varies and what we can learn from each other. And one of the beauties of what we've done today and what you'll be doing for the next 2 weeks is that this is a framework that can be applied to other places, isn't it? It's something that can be taken on by people and used in their own ways. I'll go to a question from that. I wish I prepared it a little bit better, and now I haven't. And now
well, let me just say, John, for a second, that one of the things, I mean, Michael and I appreciate what was just said, and while we haven't traveled around the world and seen places, we certainly read and we understand that, again, the growth of human population and the growth of urban centers is having this impact, and we recognize that with a smaller land base per number of people, we have to be very cognizant about using that precious land in the best way that we can sustainably. And that over the next two webinars that Michael and I will lead, we will begin to get into much more specific detail about the practical application of what we've talked about today. Michael and I just wanted to introduce everybody to what had happened here, but the next two webinars will really, the next one will get into more detail about how the scientific method and critical thinking is important in the design of a framework for ecosystem approach to urban forestry in any region. And then the third webinar will get into very detailed step-by-step applications of the framework that Michael and I put together. So.
Well, we're going to necessarily jump around quite a bit through these questions. And as you said, I think some of them will be addressed in future in the next 2 weeks. So please, if there's anything that you're clearly going to go into in a couple of weeks, just say it and we can move on. But a question from Rahul, who I just referenced there, is how do you implement these plans in overcrowded cities like Delhi? Again, I'm sure you're going to go into some of that in a couple of weeks, but just maybe a little sneak preview. How truly applicable is this to everywhere?
Well, we think that what we're going to talk about, the process that the approach, the framework that we're going to lay out for you over the next couple of weeks is applicable regardless of where you go. Now, we also think that it's important to recognize that everywhere is different. And so we have a broad framework by which we're going to sort of go through our approach, but it will vary and should vary depending on where you are. And but the foundations, the principles of utilizing science to get information, gather that information, bring people together, create opportunities for communication and sharing of ideas, those principles apply regardless, we feel like, wherever you are. And then this very step-by-step process that we're going to outline in the third one, we think, again, the steps along the way are underlying principles that will work regardless of where you're located in the world.
Michael, that's right on the money, buddy. Rahul, it's what we're talking about is looking at the urban forest as a system. Okay, and in your case, I've not been to where you're talking about, but I grew up in Brooklyn in New York City, so I know what it means to live in a very densely populated area. We believe that this framework will work because it starts out with people. And just because you have a lot of people doesn't mean it doesn't work. It means that the people get to express their values, and those values are the foundational part of then what happens in the landscape in which they live.
So something a little bit different. There's been a couple of questions coming in. One from Rachel, and I know Rachel's just said in the chat, you've got to go now. Yes, it's being recorded and it will be available. So if you've already gone, you'll see this recorded, but then you won't know. But anyway, that's an existential problem we'll deal with. Rachel's asked, does the city's inventory include trees or tree cover on private land? And I'd just like to link that as well to a question from Matt, who said, how does Tampa deal with the fragmented ownership in the urban forest? Does it have strong ordinances protecting and regulating private trees? So two slightly different questions, but how do private trees fit into this?
Well, I'll just jump in on the first part of that, and then Rob, you can talk about the second part. But this, as you saw in that first map, or excuse me, not the first map, but one of the maps I showed you, we randomly located plots across the city and then across the subbasin watersheds. Randomly located. And that was really an important part of science, right? In making sure that you're getting not a biased sample. And so those plots could fall in people's backyards. They could fall on federal lands owned by the military. They could fall out in the middle of a swamp. They could fall in the coastal mangroves and downtown Tampa. So the whole gamut of the city was measured. And when we think, again, we're thinking as foresters, is that you can measure in small areas, small stands, small subsets of the forest and create management actions for those areas. But if you want to try to get an understanding of the urban forest, you needed to measure the entire forest. And so we were going into people's backyards in some cases. And that has its own set of challenges associated with that and getting permissions and whatnot. But it was very important to us to make sure that we included both the private trees and those and including their services that they provide, as well as those that were managed by the city municipality itself.
In Tampa, as in much of the United States, more than 50% of the urban forest is on private land. In the region that we live in, private property is very coveted. In other words, people do not like to be told what to do on their private land. So much of the work that gets done on this greater than 50% of the urban forest has to be done in a cooperative manner and is often facilitated by government agencies by providing education, training, and in some cases, financial support for doing different activities. I can tell you that two of the focus groups we looked at within the city of Tampa, we asked just one question. If I gave you a tree, would you take it? Why and why not? Okay, and so we began to learn a lot about why people wouldn't take trees to plant on their own property, and this then informed public policy about the types of training and, in fact, about creating a tree giveaway program they call Tremendous now that allowed people to plant trees on private property. Ordinances in Tampa primarily, and in Hillsborough County, and in the entire Tampa Bay watershed, are primarily based upon land use change. That is, when somebody goes to build something new, then there can be some regulation about which trees are taken out, which are not, or which parts of forests are taken out and which are not. I think that answers the question, John, if I remember right.
No, that's great. I mean, while we're on the subject of ownership and I suppose different responsibilities, Brendan's put a question in the chat. Has there been dialogue on this topic with the federal partners? And then there's some initials that you're going to have to explain to me, DOD, DOI, etc. Have you been speaking to the federal partners on this project at all?
Department of Defense, Department of Interior, I guess is the DOI, and I'm not sure which other ones you had there. But with all, you know, to the Tampa Bay Watershed Forest Working Group, we had partners that were federal. We had, you know, Rob talked about the EPA was there. We had to get permissions from the Department of Defense to get out there on the MacDill Air Force Base. They were actually out there on near their shooting ranges in one case taking measurements. So they had to be escorted out there on the property. We brought a lot of entities into this conversation, and they engaged at varying scales. Sometimes some partners were very engaged. You know, for example, our EPA partner, you know, really got excited about what was happening. The U.S. Forest Service is involved and engaged, and you know, Wayne Zipper was our early partner, but others within that organization have come down and seen a lot of value. And certainly we utilize some of their modeling tools that they've developed. So we involve federal partners, state level partners, and down to the municipalities, and tried to bring in a lot of different smaller municipalities within the watershed. So really trying to have all those government entities involved.
Yeah, and you know, we do have to give a quick shout out to Dave Nowak, who I first met years ago in Baltimore when he was beginning to do his research into creating what would become U4 and then later on iTree. Because our first analysis of Tampa, we did directly with Dave when he was still up in Syracuse. And so he actually ran all the models, him and his partner, his colleague did. So that's important. You know, it's when you get higher up in the bureaucracies of the government, they don't necessarily want to get too involved down in local level dealings, but always when we've reached out and we've had a good collaborative type of a project, we've gotten positive responses from state and federal agencies.
Brilliant. We've got a few questions about the social survey, and that's certainly something I'm very interested in. I guess I wanted to ask before I went too deeply into that, are you going to be covering, well, let's take Shannon's question, will the next session discuss the social survey in more depth? Can you give examples of the evolution of the questions, the development of those questions, or should we do that now, or is that one for another week?
That we'll discuss that in more detail during the next webinar. Yeah.
Okay.
But I certainly can answer if there's a general question.
Okay. Well, we've got a couple. Oh, sorry, Michael. Were you?
I saw one of the questions was sort of this issue of how are you making sure you're hearing all the voices? And,
yes. Well, that's the one I wanted to focus on really, which was from Laura. did you do anything to ensure you didn't just get the views of, as Laura's put it, the more elite or the aware? You know, how are you making sure you're reaching those people who don't necessarily go along to these meetings?
Right. So Michael, I'd like to answer that one.
Yeah, I just want to say that I think that is an important question, and
Yeah,
we will go into greater detail. But yes,
no, that's right, and we'll talk about that a bit more next time too. These are the things we've been learning. We've known for years that the people who fill out surveys online or in the mail or who come to meetings tend to be the people who have the time and or the money to be able to do that. If you're somebody who's working 2 jobs to make ends meet, you're not going to show up at a meeting, no matter whether you set it up for Saturday morning or Thursday night. You know, you're working and you're tired and you're going to do that. Also, a lot of people who are stressed financially or who feel disenfranchised because of past prejudices or inability to affect change in government are less likely to answer surveys. And so Michael and I are keenly aware of that. In the city of Tampa, that's where the focus groups came in, okay? We recognized that our surveys, our initial couple of surveys did that. I can tell you that Sean Landry deliberately did a second survey where he deliberately went to what he considered disenfranchised neighborhoods so that we could combine those types of answers together, okay? But we conducted 3 different focus groups in what the US Department of Census was telling us were low-income areas. So we would go directly to the neighborhood associations and sit there with them and speak to them so that we could gather that information. Absolutely critically important, and it's not easy to deal with all the time. But nonetheless, it's critical, and if you don't deal with it, you're missing a big chunk of the values of the citizens of these growing metropolitan regions.
yeah, and even when we take this to other places, this is a challenge, and so and how you work with those different groups is really important. And it does not, we don't have a silver bullet on this one at all. There's a lot of learning to be done and how to make sure and ensure that those voices are heard. And right now, the one answer I feel like we can give is work at it, be aware of it, and work at it, and you know, just try different approaches to get to those voices, because we don't have a slick answer other than just sort of work and make those connections.
And involve social scientists.
And that's one of the things about this whole effort, we laid it out. Everything we described happened over, and is still happening, but happened over a long period of time. And this whole idea of managing these urban forests, you're not going to be able to go in and do these kinds of things in a year or 2 years. It's a long-term approach we're talking about here.
Right. This is an enormous change we're talking about, an enormous change in the paradigm of looking at cities as not just being engineered sanitary cities, but actually the reincorporation of nature back into the city. And of course, everybody's going to have an opinion about, and rightly so, has opinion about what they want, where they want it, and how they want it to happen. Social scientists, my friends, they have to be brought into and be part of the team that helps you do this.
I think that sort of assurance of the involvement of all parts of the community is really important. As I know you're aware, one strand that keeps coming out in the webinars we've been doing has been green equity, you know, and green inequity, and who has access to this green space. And people who know far more about this than myself have told me, you know, if the people making the decisions look just like us three, then that's not necessarily going to translate into, you know, an equitable green estate. You need to be engaging all voices, and that's become very obvious in the coronavirus crisis. You know, don't go out, use your garden. Well, what if you haven't got a garden? Then you're reliant on good quality local public space. So hopefully those questions are being talked about a bit more now. So that's really good to see. Margaret's asked a question that I've jotted down because I wanted to ask, and brilliantly someone else has asked it for me. What happens if the first survey demonstrates that the majority of the community values development over conservation? What happens if you say to the people, what are your social values? And they say, we just hate trees. We don't want them. We want something else.
That's what they want.
Well,
That's what they want.
I think, Michael, that's right. I mean, that's what the people are saying. So if me, as a member of that community, am a conservationist, a forest conservationist, then I look at the social survey as being very, very valuable information. And what that tells me or informs me is that there's going to be no movement on the conservation of the urban forest until there's a recognition of the value of the urban forest. And so that the emphasis for urban forest management then needs to be absolutely focused on relaying the values that people are concerned about. And that's what that tells me. It's not a negative thing. It's a piece of information to make better decisions about management. It just shifts management away from saying, oh, we're going to plant 10,000 trees this year to, whoa, wait a minute, that may not be the best use of our little budget that we have. Maybe the best thing we need to do is to put on workshops and have different discussions and lead discussions at the neighborhood levels and see if it's possible to engage people in the recognition of the value of trees and forests in their neighborhood.
Yeah, and to not sound so flippant as that's what they want, but to also think about it from this perspective is that, you know, if when you're building a house, a lot of times you sit down with an architect and you think you know what you want, and you articulate that to the architect, they draw it out, and it's not until you see the plan that you realize, oh, that's not what I want. Actually, I really don't want it to look that way. And so a lot of times people will just you know, first, without understanding what it is they really want, that, you know, that first round of responses might be, we don't want trees. And so let's begin to have that conversation, as Rob's talking about what are those trees and why, what, you know, trying to understand why don't we want those trees and what are the concerns there. And then all of a sudden you can begin to think about and have conversations about, well, what are some of the problems that they see in trees? Why, you know, how might we address those concerns? And they might begin to see that it's not really that they don't want trees, they just don't want some of the things that come along with them. And so it's an opening of a conversation rather than the end of a conversation.
And Michael, I think that's what we found when we used Dave's U4 models initially, iTree today, is that these models are actually a way to open the door for a conversation. And this is exactly what happened when you and I met with the mayor's staff in Tampa back in 2006. And the head of the planning department said, well, how many trees do we need? How much canopy do we need? And you turned around to him and said, that's the wrong question. You know, what is it that you need? What is it that you need from the forest? And then we can help you tell you how to manage the forest. So anyway, good.
A couple of sort of related questions and comments to that. Sorry, we will move on to something else in a minute. But Brinley has made a point. Shouldn't us urban foresters be preempting societal needs, not waiting for feedback? Brinley's saying a particular interest is the strategic provision of food trees within urban areas. So I guess maybe there's another comment there from Brinley as well about should we be going beyond what we're expecting in terms of climate and looking towards, are we going to have to feed ourselves in the cities? And on the same kind of line, Bill's quoted Steve Jobs there saying quite often people don't know what they want until you show it to them. Is it enough to be asking them what they think, or should we be telling them what they should want?
I think it's, first off, what Michael and I will lay out over the next two webinars is that we have acted principally in the role of scientists. We have a practical bend, and so we're very open to dealing with practical solutions to identified problems. But within the public realm, our dialogue has been one of scientists, and we've kept it that way. We've kept our opinions to ourselves, because our opinions when making decisions about public urban forest management plans, government-led plans, is not relevant in terms of what gets done and what doesn't. What we do tell them is about what the science tells us, which is what they don't know. And that's why they keep coming back to us, because they recognize that we don't have something to sell to them. We are not salesmen, right? That's not what we're doing. I do have an opinion. God knows, John, you know that. But when we're dealing professionally like that, we're not selling anything. And so we're trying to represent science as cleanly as possible. So the question, going back to the question of preemptiveness, I think it's important for us, and we don't shirk from this as scientists, to say, look, this Anthropocene is emerging. These growing metropolitan regions are emerging. This is happening. So we tell people that, right? And we say, just like we're going to talk a little bit more later on about that 32,000 hectares of a rare, threatened, and endangered species habitat, that was our thing there. We went to this group of people who had closed off those areas to people and told people to stay away. And we said, look, you have got to engage people and invite them in, because you are about to be surrounded by a city, all of it, right? So we told them. So that was preemptive. And we said, you have to create a strategic plan that deals with the fact that you are now in a city and you are not out in peri-urban or in a rural area. So that's the way we think about preemptive. And of course, we try to help governments understand through looking at change, value change and biophysical change over time, that they need to adjust and not wait for reaction. So our social surveys are not about reaction. That's why we're encouraging governments to monitor the social change every 5 years, so it stops being reaction. So you stop going out and asking, what's the problem? And you're engaged in, well, how's it going? Let's look at how things are going. How do you feel about how it's going? Michael?
Yeah, to an earlier point you made, I think it was very important is our role, and this whole process has been a scientist, and that's, I think, been our value to the table. That what we brought is one major value is that we are seen as unbiased in this. We're not telling people what the outcome's going to be. We're telling them how to measure it and what it looks like, and how they need, how they can think about it and how they can talk about it. But we don't go into these telling people what their management plan is going to be, what their goals should be. We help facilitate and work with them to create those themselves. And I think that's a very important point to keep in mind, is that while, as you said, we have opinions, we have to sort of put those in check and sort of stay at that facilitator level and allow them to come to those things. Provide them with that opportunity to have those conversations.
Well, just one more thing on the social surveys, just because there's so many questions about it. I know we'll be touching on it in future webinars, but this is something I think really sort of caught the imagination. It's a great question from Ian. It's not that long, but I'll just read it out to you. Hang on a minute, I've looked at the wrong question from Ian. Ian, you've sent me 2 questions and now I'm looking at the wrong one. And the question is, this doesn't normally happen. There we are. When you've performed the social surveys and engagements, have they produced consistent results across demographic groups? So do less well-off areas, for example, where neighborhood greening might yield the greatest benefit, engage and benefit in a comparable way to more well-off suburbs? Do you find that people have the same priorities and views of trees across demographic lines?
I'm going to say that when we compared county or regional or city surveys that we've conducted and compared them to national ones, that there is no statistical significantly different aspects to it. Regionally and locally, You'll find differences because there are differences in the concerns and the physical nature of different neighborhoods, ownership patterns, income. And yes, there will be differences there have been identified differences when we go to extremes. So when we look at the answers that we might get from a wealthy, homogeneously white suburb, and then we look at an inner city neighborhood of color, we will get some disparity. It is difficult to tell exactly what's going on sometimes. It's not always so clear. The focus groups are a great way to get at that, by the way, and we'll talk more about that next time. But the social surveys themselves are a broader expression of what's going on, and the focus groups are when you can go to those individual, obviously different groups and really get really good feedback. But again, social scientists need to help you with that. Michael and I are not social scientists, but we have, so are there differences? Yeah, there are differences, but the social surveys don't usually pull them out very, very well. It's the focus groups and the nominal group sessions, the smaller groups that do. Michael?
I'd just say from a scientific standpoint, again, this is an area that I think there's a tremendous amount of need for more work and more understanding. I think we're sort of scratching the surface with our understanding of that variance. And that's why, a lot of times the stats don't bear it out. You don't see any real differences. People sometimes feel it and think that there are differences or not, but we really don't have enough science behind it to make those kinds of statements. And that's, if anything, I'd say that's our call. That's one of the things we really feel is important, is to bring attention to this and to bring more people into asking these kinds of questions. Because I personally, I don't feel like I'm in the right position to answer that definitively.
Yeah, I mean, Michael and I now have 3 different social scientists engaged in dialogue about what we're doing. So, and this is something for all of us as urban foresters, is to recognize that these social skills, and I don't mean just talking to people, but being able to facilitate, being able to develop consensus among in different settings with people. These are skills that you have to learn and to hone. And certainly the idea of doing social science, we are engaging with social scientists and found that to be the best way to go.
Right. I think that's important. And I think that's actually an interesting point, Rob, is to think about our training of future urban foresters and people involved in this field. Is so often, again, my thinking has all, traditionally was sort of to think about, we really need to understand the ecological elements of the forest. And I did not get that kind of training and foundational understanding of the social side of this field. And so I think as we move forward, that's something for all of us to think about, is pushing academic institutions to incorporate that into the training.
So much about collaboration, isn't it? And not one. I think actually this is one of the things that Rob first said when we first met, was that there's a lot of stuff you don't have to know. You just have to know the people that you can ask, and then you can all work together as a collective. And I think that's definitely something to remember. Okay, question from Sherwin in the Philippines. Landscape architect in the Philippines. Great to have landscape architects watching. Thank you. In your opinion and experience, what works best? Community-led conservation or government-led through policies and laws?
I'll take a shot at that first. Again, in urban areas, we have a lot of land being owned by the public entity. And so while I said in the city of Tampa, for instance, that greater than 50% of the urban forest was on private land, it was only about 47% that was on public land, actually. And so it's both. It's really both. And of course, the public entity is, at least in our society, is run based upon the values of the people who elect them. And so fundamentally, I guess I have to say that community conservation, if you're looking at the values of people, is fundamental to both local conservation on private land and the types of policies and regulations that occur within the public realm. Within the public realm, you run the flaw of creating regulations, laws, to manage very diverse and ever-changing ecological systems. And these laws and regulations do not and cannot manage these ecological systems very well because they are ever-changing and they include the humans. And we can't stop saying that enough, that ecosystems are not ecosystems unless you include human beings in them. Human beings are part of ecosystems. So the answer to your question is, it's going to take both. I think laws and regulations are a way to deal with public land, to ensure that the community is actively engaged in determining the values that guide the science and technologies that operate on public land. But the majority of the forest itself is owned by individuals and neighborhoods, and that has to be a major focus of the political body, is the interaction with the population, not just in some type of an advisory standpoint, but actively to engage socially with the people who are electing and designing the political body. Sorry, that was a bit long-winded, but that's a big question.
It is a big question, and I think it's one that I feel like we will get into in great detail in our third module. And that's where we're going to walk through sort of that framework of how the community gets involved and engaged in the process of creating a plan that then is managed by the government entity. But
they're good, these two. They're giving you cliffhangers for future episodes. If you want to find out, you've got to tune in next week. That's all I'm hearing there.
Well, let me just throw this one thing out to you about government regulation of conservation, okay? In the United States, the fundamental law in the United States is the Constitution of the United States, okay? Within the Constitution of the United States, there are no rights that are given to anything but people. So how can a legal system that is based upon rights only for people provide rights and security for other members of the living world? That's it.
That's big ideas. See, that's why your last one was big ideas, because there's a lot to think about here. Okay, let's move geographically. Isabella's got a really good question, kind of more of maybe a general question. Isabella from Mogi Mirim. I'm going to try that. Sorry if I've just butchered the name of your city. Small city in Sao Paulo in Brazil. Isabella is a forest engineer working mainly with tree risk assessment, and would like to know your opinion about how to reassure residents that big trees are more valuable due to their many benefits as part of the urban forest, instead of something that could fall and damage their properties. They've got lots of trees falling there, mainly because of roots failing, because of space, and that's something else, Rob, I know you're working on, roots not being allowed enough space to develop. But how can Isabella convince residents that trees are assets, not just liabilities?
Well, go ahead, Michael.
Well, I'll just start off in saying they're both. And so I think it's sometimes we can't deny that there are liabilities associated with trees, and there are services that trees provide, and there are disservices they provide. And so I think that's one thing, is we shouldn't just sort of go out and say that the trees are all good and don't cause any problems. And I think that's important to state that up front. I think the other thing that's important to state is that you use science, you use the published information as much as possible. and you support your arguments based on that information. If that information doesn't exist, that's the argument for place-based science. If those particular species are not well represented in the literature, and you don't have good foundational information to give to others, then I think that's the argument that we need to get that. And that's one of the things we found is that, as much as possible, you try to use the scientific body of literature, but it doesn't always apply given where you are in a particular location. And that's the value of place-based science. And that's one of the things that has really come to light from our Tampa work in the Tampa Bay watershed, is the value to the government entities in that area because the science is coming from that area. Want to add anything?
That's right, Michael. I mean, part of the reason why the science is being used is because we're doing it right here. So when we go talk to an administrator or a public political body, we can say, we did that right in your town. We did that right in this watershed. This wasn't a study that was done in Los Angeles and we just kind of generalizing it and bringing it here. The other thing, and the two questions kind of go together. One of the earlier questions talked about preemptive stuff, and then this one having to do with risk and benefits. So first off, I want to caution everybody about, and Michael just did it, Dave Nowak has created iTree, and it is great. And it delineates a good number of the benefits that we get from the urban forest. But be careful not to just take all of the benefits and just go out and talk about the benefits and think that everybody's just going to take that as meaning that urban forests are just all good. Because many of us who work in urban forests actually have to take down trees too, and also have to deal with the damage that can occur, particularly where we live. We get a lot of hurricanes. But the other thing is, preemptive wise, within the city of Tampa and within the Tampa Bay watershed, we have taken the survey we've done, we've identified all the trees that occur, and then we use the scientific literature to delineate the habitat, that is the pH, the space, the hydrology, the amount of salt, the height, the breadth, the whole thing, how far from paved surfaces they have to be. And we have created a matrix so that planners and people can look at the trees that grow in their area and they can say, okay, I have this space for a tree. What should I plant there? And they can see from that great list, we got about 110, 115 species, they can say, oh, these 5 trees fit there and they will thrive there. And that will reduce the amount of risk over a long period of time. As far as like big trees going in older developments and older spaces where sidewalks have been redone and roots have been shaved, and that's something for an on-the-ground arborist to assess. And I wish we had our good friend and colleague, Andrew Kozer, who I know is watching right now, on the line right now, because that's his real forte, is risk assessment. But that's something that well-trained arborists need to assess on a site-by-site basis. I don't think we can make generalizations about that.
We can't say that it will vary by species, though, right? I mean, I think that's a fair statement to say, is that big trees and their strengths or whatever are going to vary by. There are certain species that are more robust as they're bigger trees versus others.
Sure, and the architecture based upon the way they've been trimmed over the years and all.
Right.
Okay, so we're an hour and 40 minutes in. We've still got more than 150 people watching, I have to say. So thank you all so much. This has been brilliant. A couple more questions, and I'll just ask you to just summarize, I suppose, the positions and lead into next week. One question I wanted to ask from Paul Mandabondabo from Papua. Paul's working on an amazing project in Papua called Green Cities for Papua. And I'm actually working with Paul, full disclosure. Paul's a good friend of mine. We're working together on this. But we're certainly going to be looking at some of the work that's been done in Tampa as Paul looks to see what can be implemented in Jayapura and Biak. And an important thing I know for Paul is about cultural values and local wisdom. There's a lot of local wisdom, a lot of traditions around trees, some spiritual aspects of trees, the things that can't be quantified, the things that can't be valued. How do you look to incorporate local wisdom and the cultural aspects into a management plan?
Well, I'll jump on that, Michael.
All right.
So here in our country and in the areas that I've worked in, at least, these metropolitan areas are much newer than probably what you're talking about. They're more recent. And so wisdom, in terms of intergenerational wisdom about the forest, is not as prevalent as it might be where you are. So we do not necessarily look into that directly. What we do, because of the short span of time, for instance, using Tampa as the example again, we look at historic records. The city of Tampa has only existed since around 1840. So it's less than 200 years old. So we have all kinds of maps, or written records, diaries, about what it was and how it was used, at least historically. And for us, historically is 200 years. And I realize when we go to other parts of the world, historically, that doesn't mean that to us. Unfortunately for us, the Native Americans who were here at that time are no longer here. Okay, so we have lost that great valuable resource. But it is an incredibly valuable perspective, and a very, very valuable perspective, I believe, because again, we are recognizing that ecological systems include people and their memories and their shared experiences and their shared understanding of how the landscape works. It's a much more fundamental understanding and a different perspective than science can bring. It's not a scientific perspective, but it does not mean that it does not have a great validity, because science is not the only way for us to look at all of this. It is one way of looking at it. We believe it has great merit, but we don't believe that science is the only way of considering how you manage the land. And certainly when we look at art, which is vitally important, as you demonstrated with a great webinar on Mesopotamia, and we look at music and these deep cultural expressions of landscape and of belonging, these are essential to our better understanding of building more livable and sustainable communities that incorporate the forest in them.
I'm not going to approach that one. Rob just nailed it.
It was perfect. Thank you, Rob. Okay.
Hey, I'd love to find out what's going on in Padua. That sounds.
I mean, that would be my short answer. Is I would love to hear sort of that question turned around and ask it back to the person that asked the question.
Well,
how should we do that? Because
I don't
feel like we have a good answer.
I can tell you that Paul Mandabondabo will be doing a webinar for us at some point, telling us all about Papua and some of the amazing history and stuff that's going on out there. So I'm saving Paul up, don't worry. Okay, so just one final question, very quick one. Michael, I've been very worried about your hedgehog. It hasn't moved for the last 2 hours on your chair behind you. Sarah asks if that's a big cone or a quarter pine.
It is. This is a giant cone here. You can see.
Look at that.
About the size of my head. You can see those nice hooks on them. This thing weighs a good bit too. So yeah, I love having this. I got a bunch of cones in my office here. So that one, I was hoping somebody would see that in the chair back there, and I'm glad to see somebody's picked it out.
And so is that a quarter pine?
It is, yes.
Sarah, that is some top identification work. You're at a hell of a range there. It's thousands of miles away.
A+.
No. I would say we'd invite you on, but you've already been on. Okay. I'm so sorry. There's so many good questions, so much good chat. We haven't had time for all of it. If you want additional questions asking, maybe email me, john@trees.org.uk, and I can forward them on to Rob and Michael, and we can see whether things can be weaved in or covered. So please let me know. I just wanted to say, really, Rob, Michael, do you just want to sum up very quickly some of your thoughts of today and maybe where we're going to be going this time next week?
I'll give a couple comments, and then Rob, you can have the final word there. But first, I think I hope a couple things have come out loud and clear. Is that management of these urban and urbanizing forests is not just about managing the trees. It's a social endeavor, and that we've got a lot to learn about that part of the management of these forest systems. I think it's also important. I think that critical thinking and science be involved in the management, development of management plans for these areas, and how that allows us to provide a way to have conversations about these forests. And then I think one other last point I'd like to say is thinking at multiple scales is how important that's been for us, is thinking about managing these forests. It's important, especially, I know a lot of your audience is arborists and sort of managing at the tree level, but also being able to zoom out to that broader landscape scale and then zoom back in. And I think as we manage these urban and urbanizing areas, that's going to be a critical skill set for us to have, is the ability to zoom in, zoom out, zoom in. And that's both on the biophysical side of things as well as the social side of things. Those are some of the points that I'd like to make. Rob?
Yeah, just to reiterate that, this is basic, conservation in general, urban forestry in particular, but all conservation is primarily a social endeavor, okay? The context in which management occurs is social. And that social part of it, science can help us with that too. And Michael and I have mentioned several times that we deal with social scientists. And we don't try to play this one off the cuff and pretend that we can just do this on our own and just make up surveys and things like that are actually valid. Place-based science, absolutely critical. Get the science done where the work is. We are talking to so many people from all different parts of the world, different climates, different soils, different hydrologies, different cultures, different histories. It's important to take this ecological science that we have in common and use it as a touchstone to investigate your own unique areas and to provide answers to the problems and questions that you face there doing that. Also, finally, I just want to say that we're going to get much more specific over the next two webinars. We're going to be looking at how do we take this scientific method, both the biophysical and the social, and combine them with critical thinking to design frameworks for ecosystem approach to urban forestry that we believe can be adapted in different parts of the world. And finally, on the third webinar, we're going to get down to the brass tacks, step by step, of how we did it here. And we believe those steps can also help inform you in terms of the development of your own framework for taking an ecological approach to urban forestry that incorporates people back into the landscape and recognizes that people are a part of the systems in which they live.
One of the things I just want to add on that, in that process of sharing that with you, we're not just going to sort of give you the success story. We're going to share some of the missteps along the way as well, and things we've learned and mistakes we've made and how we've learned from them. So I think hopefully that's helpful. To me, that's always critical.
Yeah, I think my nose has got some scabs on it from walking in the walls from now and again. And also, this is great what they're doing at the Arboricultural Association. We would love to hear a little bit more about what you're doing, okay? And so what I want to do finally is to share with you, hang on just a second, our email addresses. Can you see that, John?
Yeah, we can see that.
We want to have the dialogue. We want to share, not to just share our own story, but to hear about your stories and about what you're dealing with and facing. And if there's any way that we can help you and be of greater service to you to do that also. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you both so much. That was absolutely great. Please, everybody, register if you haven't already for next week and the week after. I put it in the chat earlier. We have more than 220 people watching this from 6 continents. It's an incredible reach. The people of Antarctica consistently let us down, but if any of you can get over there for next week, then you will win a hedgehog or something similar. So that's it. Thank you very much. Feel free to contact Michael or Rob or email myself, john@trees.org.uk. Have a wonderful evening, a great week, and we really look forward to picking up this discussion again next Wednesday. So thank you so much, everybody. Good night.
Stay safe.
Good night. I'll have another cone next week.